Hello my dear friends, how's it going? I hope I find you all in good health and safe and sound. I'm Mario Thurger and today I'm going to talk about the mandrake, a plant that throughout the history of humanity has gained quite the remarkable reputation, occupying from antiquity until today a very special and prominent place with regard to magical plants in magic and traditional folk beliefs. Of course, there are several plants that were and still are part of the ointments that witches used to smear their bodies so they could fly to the Sabbath. But indeed, today they are still used as homeopathic and phytotherapeutic and also as allopathic remedies, since some alkaloids are used in anesthetics with proven efficacy and well, on the other hand, they are also powerful and lethal poisons, though. However, I would like to talk to you today about the mandrake, but in relation to its use in medieval Scandinavia. As stated here before in this channel, little is known about magical and medicinal plants in Northern Europe in pre-Christian periods, unfortunately. And even at the time of religious transition at the end of the Iron Age, the Scandinavian Iron Age, we do not have much evidence about plants and their effects and how they were used in any kind of traditional magic and for what purposes. As I said in the video about the magic runic formula Allu and also Laukas or Laukar, we have some indications about leeks and linen, and from some written sources we can have a certain idea of its effects for medicinal and magical purposes. But it is quite difficult to have any concrete information, right? Mostly we are in the presence of plants that could be used in a traditional magical panorama in relation to what can be understood perhaps as necromancy, for a lack of a better term. In this case, in the Scandinavian case, in the preservation of parts of the body for purposes of divination. But we are also in the presence of plants that in some way would also serve for fertility purposes and even for love purposes, loss or gain of virility, etc. I think I should repeat what I said in other videos, if you don't mind. When it comes to the use of plants and herbs in Scandinavia, especially as medicinals, we only have written sources after Christianization, and from that moment onwards, herbal medicine in Scandinavia is pretty much the same as in Italy and the Middle East Islamic medieval caliphate of the Middle Ages, as clergymen brought such works with them into Scandinavia, right? So, it is obviously much harder to have any concrete evidences concerning plants and herbs within traditional folk magic in Northern Europe before Christianization. And the truth is that the modern roots of Scandinavian folk magic in relation to the use of herbs come from the contact with the Mediterranean during the Middle Ages. As I've pointed out on the video about the Berserkir and Ulfedin, the first herbals and other medical texts in Scandinavia were not produced until the 13th and the 14th centuries, after the introduction of Christianity and the Christianization, the official Christianization of Scandinavia, with, of course, a great influence of continental European beliefs and practices about medicine, herbalism and healing, especially from the medical school at Salerno, Italy, which in turn was obviously ultimately based on the works of the classical Greek physicians Galen, Dioscorides and Celsus, and of course on the very important Arabic medicine from Avicenna. Now, the earliest surviving herbal texts produced in Scandinavia was the 13th century Utebogen or Liber Herbarum, the Book of Herbs of Master Henrik Heverstreng, 1244 of the Common Era, from Roskilde in Denmark. This herbal book contains translations from Meisters Dividibus Herbarum, circa 1090, and De Gradibus Liber by Constantinus Africanus, 1050, Salerno, Italy. It's important that you retain this information so we can move on. Now, A troppa bella donna, a troppa mandragora, aiosiamos niger, and nigella sativa. These were four of the most used plants in European medicine and magic for many, many centuries, and of course, important plants in traditional witchcraft, traditional folk magic, let's say. All these plants began to be used in Denmark, influenced by Germany, only from the 14th century onwards, and have since then been known throughout Scandinavia, throughout the north of Europe. We know that the plant, just a curiosity, the plant popularly known as belladonna, atropa belladonna, beautiful woman, beautiful lady, was precisely used by women since the high Middle Ages to dilate the pupils by dripping the juice of the blackberries in the eyes and give them a special shining appearance and thus enhance beauty. And it was also widely used as a potent analgesic and antipyretic, and also for poisoning, since a high dosage would lead to death. Even today, belladonna is still used as one of the most popular homeopathic medicines. But today I want to focus on the plant considered the quintessential witch's herb or plant or root, which is the mandrake, Atropa mandragora. Representations of this plant are found in several medieval and herbal, medieval and Renaissance manuscripts, and it is always mentioned as one of the main ingredients for the preparation of all kinds of potions or spells, and of course, ointments. The presence of the mandrake is recorded in literature since antiquity, in medieval poems, in the Bible as well, in Shakespearean tragedies, and to this day in several books and movies, in pop culture in general, actually. One of the most interesting characteristics is the root of this plant, it has a shape that often resembles a human form. It has an anthropomorphic appearance to it, and for this very reason it was believed that it grew below the scaffolds where the semen, the sperm of those who were hanged, would fall, and their soul would pass to the plant, into the ground, which according to medieval tradition one should tie the plant to a dog's tail and then hit the dog on the head. When the animal finally ran in agony, the root was uprooted and the soul of the hanged man was freed. A peculiar belief. Humanity's need to cause violence and harm to animals never made sense to me. But anyway, this belief in relation to the hanged is quite interesting, at least for what I want to focus on here today in this video, in relation to Northern Europe. Some authors believe that the mandrake may have been related to the god Odin, whom, among over 100 names for this deity, was also called the god of the hanged, precisely. To be more precise, names such as Hangagud, god of the hanged, or Hangatyr, and Hangathothrinn, lord of the hanged. I am not going to develop here on the associations between Odin and the human sacrifices through hanging, or the idea of suffocation as a form of sacrifice to this deity. Not today, at least. However, it is important to say that, personally, I have no doubt that if the mandrake and its uses, both in medicine and in traditional folk magic, had been introduced in Scandinavia in pre-Christian periods, especially during the migration period and in plain Scandinavian Iron Age, I am sure the mandrake would have indeed become a plant somehow associated with Odin, or conversely. Or at the very least, to the mandrake it would have certainly been added some sort of folklore or mythological associations with Odin and possibly even with Freya. Alas, it is not the case. It took its sweet time for the mandrake and its uses and associated folklore to spread throughout Europe, and in a pan-European sense, so to speak, we can say that the mandrake only became widely known from the late High Middle Ages onwards, more or less by the Renaissance onwards throughout Europe, and finally reaching Scandinavia by the late Middle Ages. a long time, as you can see, after the Christianization of Scandinavia, which would have made it difficult to create an association between a pagan god with a plant that was being introduced quite in the late period in Scandinavia, not through a pagan understanding, but rather through quite the medieval Southern European mentality. But the idea that the mandrake has been associated with Odin, as some authors have suggested, as incorrect as it is not without some logic, mind you. As I said, the knowledge of the mandrake and the plant itself was introduced in Scandinavia, first in Denmark via German influence in the 14th century, and the plant was referred to in German as Galgenlein, or little gallows man. Not only this comes from the medieval belief spoken previously concerning the sperm of a hanged man, but also the association here with the gallows is of significance because in the Middle Ages, a dried root was sold as an amulet or talisman, and it was called a mannequin. Joan of Arc was accused at her trial of having a mandrake formed into a mannequin and used as an amulet for magical purposes, right? Now, those who are familiar with several European traditional folk magic will certainly remember the same action, the same procedure of creating an amulet with an anthropomorphic form or carved into such a shape through the plant fern and other ferns and other roots of other plants, right? Now, in witchcraft nomenclature, this is what we could perhaps call a familiar, or in modern terms used to describe certain animistic beliefs, this is a fetish with a particular appearance of that of a human being, serving as a little companion or familiar to aid in magical purposes. 1 second. Well, the mannequin, this mannequin as an amulet or talisman was believed to afford the owner the gift of prophecy as well as luck in business and gambling. However, the task of keeping one's mannequin happy and content was very hard, requiring specific clothing to dress the mannequin, a proper place for it to sleep, fresh milk, among other things. Taking care of it as a living creature, as a living being. It's quite interesting, this medieval, the survival of animistic perceptions even in the Middle Ages. I find it interesting, at least. So, we can imagine how this belief was augmented through the mandrake, which by itself already has a humanoid expression naturally, right? Its most remarkable physical feature is, without a doubt, the almost humanoid form the root assumes, which appears to emulate the twisted anatomy of a little human being sleeping in the earth. This anthropomorphic form comes naturally, so this is a plant and its root quite sought after to become a mannequin, to become a familiar, a fetish, a living utensil imbued with personhood to be used as an amulet. Its association with those who were hanged is peculiar because it comes from the old belief of divination through the dead, through the deceased, the original necromancy, before it became corrupted by the church as a sorcerous performance to empower the sorcerer through the control and the use of demons. The original necromancy from ancient Greek necromantia was foremost the act of communication with the dead for prophetic purposes. So this idea was somewhat retained to a certain extent. A form of divination through the dead, through the ancestors, but not just any dead in this case, but the hanged, thieves, murderers, criminals of all sorts, people who symbolized transgression, mischievousness, wickedness. And it's no coincidence that at some point during the 14th century precisely, we see in texts in French the word main de gloire, hand of glory, almost certainly a corruption of the word mandragore, from the Latin mandragora, mandrake. The hand of glory in itself could be a subject for a whole other video. Suffice it to say, the main de gloire, the hand of glory, is a preserved hand, human hand, usually the left, of an executed criminal. The hand of a thief is considered to be particularly potent, transforming the preserved hand into a candle prepared from the lard of the same criminal, which it was lit up and believed to paralyze and confound the person to whom it is exposed by the sorcerer. The hand of glory is then used as a candlestick and served a specific sorcerer's purpose. So we have this interesting mixture between medieval beliefs and classic divination through the dead, through the deceased. So the mandrake, with its almost humanoid appearance, natural humanoid appearance, became associated with those hanged, especially at a crossroads, as in traditional folk beliefs. The crossroads is always a liminal space, understood as a liminal space, a boundary, the paths of the dead, and there are innumerable accounts and methods of divination on crossroads as the physical space of the original acts of necromancy, to commune with the dead, with the ancestors, in search for information on future events. So it's no coincidence that the Icelandic word for mandrake is tjófarot, thieves' root, or the thief's root, which was used for certain sorcerer's procedures, one of which to find silver on the floor. A tradition from medieval continental Europe. So we can see why the idea that the mandrake was associated with Odin, right? It wasn't, it really wasn't, but it could very well have been, since not only Odin was also the god of the hanged, but this sense of prophecy through the dead is quite present in the figure of Odin, especially in the poem Voluspa, as Odin clearly demonstrates necromantic characteristics. Although in this case there really wasn't an association between this deity and the plant mandrake, as the knowledge of the mandrake and these associated beliefs and its uses in medicine and traditional folk magic start to formulate in the European High Middle Ages, reaching Scandinavia by the 14th century, the late Middle Ages. We are in the presence, concerning the mandrake, we are in the presence of the idea of otherworldly power associated with the corpse, which was known in Scandinavia as well, this idea of the corpse having mystical power. But the plant, the vegetable, usually associated with necromancy in Northern Europe in pre-Christian periods was the leek, whilst the mandrake is a much later European belief that is attached to the already existing belief of magical power through the corpse, the human cadaver, or human bones, or visitation of the place where people have been murdered, executed, or buried, and through a contact with such places or body remains, magical power or divinatory power was manifested or even acquired. The mandrake having such an anthropomorphic form, obviously there was an easy association between the appearance of its root with the human corpse, both of which buried in the ground, and the mandrake being the physical manifestation of the human corpse or its fluids in the ground. This animistic belief of transmigration of the soul or the embodiment of the tormented spirit into a plant, which then manifests a human likeness because of it is imbued with this personhood. The core of this belief lies in the idea of the corpse serving as a conduit to manifest chthonic powers, the manifestation of secret knowledge and mystical power from the underworld realms beneath the earth. So the mandrake would have this primary belief associated to it as a living entity assuming the form of a human being slumbering beneath the earth. As such, it is imbued with otherworldly power from both the past and the beyond. But it is worth noting that in German, a mandrake root is known as Alraun, either the root itself or carved into a human form, carving the root into a human form, which, according to popular belief, has magical powers and helps bring wealth and happiness. The etymological root of Alraun or Alraun is most special. You see, it is the same etymological root for Swedish Alruna, Alruna, or Alruna or Alrona in Old High German, Dutch Alraun, or Alrune in High German, and Olrun in Old Norse. These common etymological roots transport us to the very Indo-European word runa, to whisper or to mutter, from Proto-Indo-European hell, as a harsh whispering sound of sorts, a lament like a groan or moaning or wail. In terms of the Old Norse word Olrun, we see this name applied to a Valkyrie, Valkyria, a feminine entity often associated with both fate, divination, or prophecy, as well as an association with death and choosing the slain in the battlefield. Semi-divine feminine figures, weavers of fate, associated with battle magic, carnage, death, and extreme violence. Overall, an association with the dead as well, and with the deities Odin and Freya, as two deities that preside over the dead chosen in the battlefield. So this is also one of the reasons why it has led to the belief that the Mandrake was already known in the north in pre-Christian periods and associated with Odin and death and the hanged and the Valkyries and so on and so forth. But that is not the case. Indeed, it is not. Although we see here in this incorrect assumption quite the logical association, and it's perfectly understandable to assume a connection here between Odin and the Mandrake. Just to make sure we all understand this, the Valkyrie wasn't called Mandrake, and her name, Holrun, cannot be translated as Mandrake. The name Holrun or Holrun is possibly the junction of two words, possibly Höl, derived from Alu, and the word Runa, which could either mean ale rune, as some sort of a runic character, a magical runic character, or a reference to the very runic charm Alu, the word for ale, right, written in runes, which became a well-known magic runic formula in the Iron Age. So we have this earlier feminine name implying a sense of mystery and magic, which during the late medieval period was attributed to the root of the mandrake, as a plant which was new in Germanic and Nordic contexts in the High Middle Ages. As such, it was applied to it, this feminine name, and in relation to secret magic, a mystery, and possibly giving it an understanding of its powerful charming effects by associating it with the runic formula Alu implicit in the name Alruna. My apologies for repeating certain parts of this subject. Please, don't take this the wrong way. It's not like I think you are incapable of understanding at first. It's just that sometimes, even when I purposely repeat things to make it all clear, there's always someone or a couple of people who did not understand for some reason, and I'm not saying it's your fault. It can very well be mine and failing to express myself in the correct way. So I just want to make all this clear so we can all understand and move on. The historical reality here is that when the mandrake in the Middle Ages was finally introduced in Germany and via the Germans into Scandinavia in the 14th century, these old or earlier names were appointed to this plant upon its medieval arrival in Germanic contexts, which actually demonstrates us the medieval perception of this plant in the north, an association with magic, mystery, an association with the etymological root of runa, and rune, as a mystery, a whisper, a sort of secret mystery, which lies within the earth, because it was new and its magical implications were not yet widely known in the north. So it is applied a term to the mandrake's root that conveys this old sense of mystery and secret magic concealed within the soils. So quite the popular relationship with the mandrake begins to take form in the north, and as well as throughout the Middle Ages all over Europe, the High Middle Ages. As you can see, the Latin name Mandragora did not follow into the medieval north, so instead the surviving Germanic and Nordic folk and hidden magical religious beliefs were placed upon the arrival of the plant in the High Middle Ages, certainly adding to it other earlier belief systems within the traditional folk magic. I thought I should share this with you because sometimes we come about certain historical facts that seem to easily create a connection between elements, but sometimes it isn't that easy, and we are being very much deceived by ourselves and our predisposition to find patterns. There wasn't a connection between the Mandrake and Odin in pre-Christian periods, but it is easy to have that illusion given the evidences here presented before. We really must be careful, and it is always necessary to contextualize and carry out documentary criticism for all primary sources. Well, as we can imagine, the root of the mandrake having a shape similar to the human being was the subject of several beliefs, including that it would be the very plant ancestor of humankind, since many mythologies, as you know it, and the religious beliefs mention this ancestry of humanity directly linked to nature, to the trees and to the plants. Obviously, this aspect only increased the belief in the magical power and potency of this plant. Due to its potent alkaloids, mandrake root was used primarily to induce hallucination. So it is not strange to have been a very used plant, or at least mentioned quite a lot as being the witch's plant or the witch's herb or root. When used in ointments and these spread on the nasal and vaginal and anal mucous membranes, it quickly entered the bloodstream, often producing lethal effects. So best be careful. And by the way, careful with your wallet. There's still a lot of illegal trade of mandrake, illegal for obvious reasons. And if it isn't obvious, I'll explain to you in the comments if you want to know. But basically, it can get you permanently into the realm of the ancestors. You see, it's very hard to measure the appropriate dosage for each person because not all bodies are the same or built in the same manner, and just a little bit can easily kill a person. But best be careful with your wallet, as I was saying. There's actually a lot of people that will try to sell you ginger root carved into the shape of a human body to pass as mandrake. Well then, I hope this video was useful. Don't get yourself killed. Thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. And as always, thank you for today, my dear friends. Farewell.